Okay, I think we'll get started. Jacob, are we up and running on sound and vision? Fantastic. Welcome. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. And just to let you know, this session is being recorded and will eventually appear on the IHR website. So I just wanted to say a few words about this new Blue Humanities initiative. I think almost everybody I know, but those I don't, Jonathan Bate is my name, divided between the English department and the School of Sustainability. So Blue Humanities is the newest initiative of the Institute of Humanities Research here. IHR has a long distinguished tradition in environmental humanities. Indeed, probably sort of the first places in the US, indeed in the world, to have a focus on environmental humanities. And many initiatives have grown from that, including a very successful productive initiative in desert humanities, which is a fairly obvious thing for us to have here in the desert. Blue humanities, ocean-focused work, is perhaps a slightly less obvious thing for us to have here in the desert. But ASU likes things that are not obvious. So just to say a few words about kind of the thinking behind it, the reasoning for having this new initiative, and some of the things that we hope we'll be able to develop. And I suppose actually in some ways, thinking about desert and ocean as parallels, things immediately come to mind as we think about the climate crisis. Extremities of drought, of heat, a desertification associated with the desert, the extremities of hurricanes, rising sea levels, coastal flooding coming from the ocean. There's a sense in which the desert and the ocean are two places traditionally inhospitable to humankind, two places that might seemingly be deserted, but that actually are full of life forms of all sorts, and places where humankind over the millennia has really sort of faced the challenges of living with difficult environments. So we're hoping that desert and ocean will come together. One aspect of this initiative is that ASU has an alliance, the so-called Plus Alliance, with the University of New South Wales in Sydney and King's College in London. And within the alliance, we've just launched a series of research symposiums focused around the four ancient elements of earth, air, fire, and water. We had an air symposium in London back in the fall. We're going to be looking at earth and desert here. And we're also going to be looking at water. So Blue Humanities obviously is going to be central to that. The other aspect of the initiative is that the rather acquisitive nature of ASU, and perhaps particularly of our president, Michael Crow, means that ASU does now have an outpost in Hawaii. Book your plane ticket soon, focusing very much on marine conservation. And we want to build connections there. And I actually started getting sort of inspired by this whole theme when one of our partners in Hawaii, the Polynesian Voyaging Society, visited us just before the pandemic. I remember having a fascinating conversation with them. They do this traditional form of voyaging across the Pacific, not using modern navigational instruments. But there was a moment in the conversation at the late lamented restaurant over the road where I realized they were talking about the continent of Polynesia. And there was no distinction between land and sea in their consciousness. For us, so much of Western thought particularly has been bounded by continents, by borders, by coastlines. But the notion that Polynesia, these islands scattered across the Pacific, is a single continent, but it's not a landmass. It's one in which the life of humankind on the ocean and humankind on the land are cognate, conjoined. And that really helped me to begin to sort of rethink some of my assumptions. In addition to that, looking to the East Coast, ASU has also recently acquired the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, and they will be heavily involved in a new a school of ocean futures within the College of Global Futures, where sustainability is located. And again, the scientists there, marine biologists primarily, of course, are very interested in a humanities perspective. We can only really begin to understand ocean futures if we understand ocean pasts. And that's where the humanities, with our long reach all the way back to Homer's Odyssey, the original ocean-going poem, seagoing poem at any rate. There's so much that we have to offer. So we've launched this initiative, and the obvious thing to do for our inaugural lecture was to bring the man who more or less invented the field, Steve Mentz. You'll be noticing I'm wearing a green shirt, and Steve is wearing a blue one, because a lot of the early work in environmental humanities, literary eco-criticism, it became known as green studies. One of the anthologies of kind of the formative pieces in the field was called the Green Studies Reader. And a lot of that work, including my own, very much comes out of traditions of pastoral, thinking about green spaces, and then relating to political green parties. And Steve, I think, thought, well, hang on, it's not all green. Blue's pretty important as well. 70% of this planet is the ocean. The hydrological cycle is dependent upon the ocean. And so for more than a decade now, perhaps 15 years, Steve has been working in blue humanities with extraordinary range and productivity, ranging from a book at the bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean through to a book called Shipwreck Modernity, which looked at globalization between the early modern period and the late 18th century from the point of view of oceans. And this is, of course, tied in with a kind of oceanic turn within historical studies. So much of the most interesting writing by early modern historians now is looking to the Atlantic, the Pacific, looking to the seas as well as the land. Steve began as a sort of, in some ways, a traditional early modernist working on Elizabethan prose. Thomas Nash in particular, you might think that has nothing to do with the sea, but of course one of Nash's books, Lenten Stuff, is all about fish, set in Great Yarmouth, the coastal port, and Steve has written a wonderful article about that. But he's definitely gone blue in a big way, and his work has extraordinary range. You only have to look at his fantastic website to see the range of his interests, which reach, as is so important to us here at ASU, reach beyond the kind of traditional academic audiences. He writes poetry, he writes for wide readership publications. He curated a fantastic exhibition at the Folger on the ocean in the time of Shakespeare. He's been a visiting fellow at the Maritime Museum in London. And he's a swimmer as well. I would say if you want an introduction to his work, you could not do better than begin with Ocean, this little book in this excellent series, Object Lessons. Wonderful range of material, some of it personal, some of it Melvillian, some Shakespearean. So to sort of launch our initiative, much of our initiative is going to be online. We're going to build a really good website. But we thought to launch the initiative, we should have an in-person event with the father of the subject, Steve Mentz.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that slightly excessive introduction, which is the spirit, I suppose, of all these kinds of things. I'm so pleased to be here. Like many people in early modern studies these days and literary studies more broadly, I think I have been watching with great amazement and just extreme pleasure to see this developments in at ASU over the past half dozen years, and it is a pleasure to finally be able to have my feet touch the land of the desert here. I will talk a little bit more about the relationship between deserts and oceans. That was like I couldn't avoid telling some jokes about deserts in the talk, but so I will get to that a bit. I do like the contrast between the blue and the green shirts, and we will be asking people to choose teams. So we'll get to that. But anyway, the real project of this talk that I'm going to share with you guys for the next little bit of time is both to introduce the Blue Humanities as an ongoing field of study, and also to provide some insight into a particularly strange feature of one of Shakespeare's strangest plays. But mainly, I'm here to talk about the coast. It's not a fixed place. There's no real line in any coastline. Nothing stays still. It's a jumble, a chaos, always moving. Everything is remade, reimagined at every instant. Things touch, but not in reliable ways. So many of you, I suspect, will already have guessed, partly from the title of the talk, that in some ways, despite this picture, that this description applies to Shakespeare's most famous geographic error, the seacoast of Bohemia and the Winter's Tale. But I want to start our conversation today by emphasizing that these negations and uncertainties apply to every coastline, real coastlines and imagined coastlines. That's what coasts are: ephemeral places, comings together of water and earth, suffused with constant dynamism and erosive uncertainty. So I want to start today by repeating my opening description. And I want to ask you to listen to it a second time, remembering that it is both a literary fantasy and also a real shoreline. And the slide that I'm using for this shows a picture of my local beach in Connecticut, which is also a coast of Bohemia. It's not a fixed place. There's no real line in any coastline. Nothing stays still. It's a jumble, a chaos, always moving. Everything is remade, reimagined at every instant. Things touch, but not in reliable ways. Did that sound different the second time? I hope so. I hope it sounded a little bit like a second chance that will redeem a play from its tragic opening act. But I also hope that that difference between the first and the second articulations of what coastlines are will help guide us through a conversation for the next hour or so about the coast of Bohemia as Shakespeare's play presents it, and as I will explore it today through a Blue Humanities perspective. So we know where Bohemia is. Shakespeare also knew where Bohemia is. It's a landlocked province in Central Europe in what is now the Czech Republic, but was in Shakespeare's time dominated by the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg Empire. I'm not going to spend time today talking about this very beautiful and exquisite early modern map of Bohemia, which Shakespeare probably knew. Because as I'm going to be talking about the Winter's Tale today, the coast of Bohemia isn't a mistake, or isn't just a mistake. It's a theatrical ecology that combines imagination and material reality under the signs of water and land. My project in this talk is to think through this coastal space in relationship to the Blue Humanities. This growing scholarly and creative discourse, the growing scholarly and creative discourses that swim under the Blue Humanities banner aim to include all waters, oceans, bays, and beaches, but also ice, marsh, and humidity. I've even heard that there's a Blue Humanities initiative springing up in the parched lands of the American desert. All coasts in material ways are mutable, unstable, and dynamic. Rachel Carson, probably the greatest 20th century American writer about what she calls the edge of the sea, emphasizes that, quote, "For no two successive days is the shore precisely the same." The mobility that Carson names unrest typifies what she calls the dual nature of water-land borders, salt or fresh, real or imagined. Water's split nature, its duality as the largest component of our bodies and the covering element of our planet, flows through physical and fictional environments. What Carson calls the unifying touch of the sea functions as material and metaphor. Water is a physical substance that we encounter every day, but which remains alien. It's the realest substance in our environment and also the most fanciful. In the centuries since Shakespeare, following his Elizabethan source Robert Greene, gave Bohemia its seacoast, this location has become a kind of byword for geographic fantasy. In exploring the cultural resonance of the Bohemian coast, I'm engaging today with ongoing work by Czech researcher Ondra Masi, whose name I might be mispronouncing, currently a visiting scholar in the Slavic School at University College London. Masi observes that many Czech writers, drawing on Shakespeare, treat the Bohemian coast as a metaphor for exile and utopia, for being both distant from and connected to a world beyond Central Europe. I'm especially grateful to Masi for sending me the poem Bohemia Lies by the Sea, which I have part of on the board, by the 20th century Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann. Bachmann's poem will help me launch this lecture through a conflation of proximity and faith. If Bohemia still lies by the sea, she writes, I'll believe in the sea again. This in the gap between the geographic adjacency of lies by and the first person assertion of faith, I'll believe, the poet invites us to a real and not real coast. This hybrid space, like Carson's beaches, unifies with its touch. Come here, Bachmann beckons, all you Bohemians, seafarers, dock whores, and ships unanchored. To be among this crew of non-human vessels and marginalized humans means to err 100 times, as I erred and never withstood the trials. The poet's errancy, like storm and shipwreck on Shakespeare's Bohemian coast, moves us out of a dry world into a wetter place. All coasts proffer an inviting splash of alienation, as if we know that the version of ourselves that touches water can never remain the same as the dry bodies that sit politely in lecture halls. Bachmann frames her poem around incommensurability. She knows that a false faith in a false seacoast fractures identity. If it's not me, she speculates, it's one who is as good as me. Remaining me and becoming as good as me, the poet surrenders to change. Her identity straining but not quite identity breaking process, I suggest, resembles the shipwreck at the heart of The Winter's Tale. When we go to the coast of Bohemia, we're never sure if we remain ourselves or only just as good as ourselves. Maybe we become unanchored ships, seafarers, Bohemians. Maybe we welcome, or maybe we need, unexpected changes. I won't today provide a full summary of what Blue Humanities scholarship and other creative work has been doing in eco-literary discourses over the first decades of the 21st century. If you like that sort of thing, and to be clear, I do like that sort of thing, I have a book for you coming out this summer from Routledge Publishing with the catchy title, An Introduction to the Blue Humanities. So, you heard it here first. But instead, what I want to do today, in the context of a reading of The Winter's Tale, is to draw attention to some animating currents that speak in particular to the Bohemian coast of this play. The three maxims on the slide present a compact summary of some of the ways in which my work in this discourse, which began when I started becoming obsessed with the presence of water in text and in environments, has moved outward into plurality. And I'm thinking in particular about a movement from a what I was going to call a narrowly oceanic, or I suppose you would say a broadly oceanic, to a more, a post-oceanic movement in Blue Humanities. And I'll try to explain what that means in a few minutes. So the first of these three currents that I wanted to draw out reaches back to an argument that I made in the book Shipwreck Modernity in 2015 about how the wet and the dry represent opposed narrative modes. I'm thinking here about the way that wet immersion creates disorientation, while dry retrospection extracts or attempts to extract meaning from immersive swirl. Especially, but not only in shipwreck context, immersion is threatening, dangerous, and alluring. From a literary critical perspective, these these catastrophes are narrative-making machines. My favorite shipwreck joke comes from Northrop Frye, who writes that in romance, shipwreck is the standard means of transportation. It's good to get laughs for a literary critical joke. It doesn't always land. But the sting of Frye's joke, and the reason I love this joke so much, is that it points in two different directions at once, right? Shipwrecks are both vehicles for divine and authorial intervention in the plot. That's how you get the hero and the heroine to where you need them to go. And they are also disasters that transport narratives, both metaphorically and literally. The project of literary culture, to extrapolate from Frye, remakes the catastrophe as standard, so that disasters become legible as forms. Wet shocks intrude into a world that humans try to keep dry. The oppositional relationship between these modes requires moments of transition and connection. It is possible, even pleasurable, to get wet, but getting too wet for too long puts survival at risk. The second Blue Humanities maxim that is one that I long ago swiped from the French mariner Samuel de Champlain, and someday I think I'll probably make bumper stickers and t-shirts. Experience is better than knowledge. Champlain wrote that in the margin of his 1632 treatise on seamanship. The aphorism sounds better in French, even my really bad French. L'expérience passe science. The echoing rhymes of experience and science emphasize the dynamic exchange between these terms, in which experience is superior to, but inextricably entangled with, the rational ordering principles of science. Experience captures the wet force of immersion, science the dry retrospection of codified knowledge. We need both things. We need to maintain the opposition between these things, and we need to recall Champlain's accurate prioritization of experience. The Blue Humanities aims to stay as close as possible to the knowledge that we find in the water. So these two maxims, both of which I've been wrestling with for years, are characteristic of currents in the Blue Humanities thinking that animated by opposition. And here you can think about the green shirts and the blue shirts. Put simply, water opposes land. In Coloride's terms, the blue provides a counter challenge to the environmentalist green. But the thing about this opposition, which is really important to me and has animated a lot of my work, but it's also true, as I'm sure everyone knows, that water isn't always blue. In fact, blue is a relatively rare color for water and a rare term for water. Shakespeare uses the term green much more often for the ocean than blue. And the material reality of the polychronic nature of water has important implications. Blue Humanities scholar Margaret Cohen, in her 2006 chapter, The Chronotypes of the Sea, identifies multiple symbolic colors that inform maritime literature, including blue water, brown water, and white water. As elaborated in her 2010 book, The Novel in the Sea, Cohen treats the maritime environment as foundational to the development of European fiction from the 17th to the 21st centuries. Much Blue Humanities scholarship today aims to make the blue in Blue Humanities resemble the post in posthuman. As Ryan Pohl noted recently in his excellent 2022 study of the eco-politics of the superhero Aquaman, the Blue Humanities is a post-humanist paradigm that thinks about and positions humans within a wider spectrum of life, including marine life. Watery eco-theoretical scholars, including Patricia Yeager, Siobhan Carroll, Lowell Duckert, Isaac Land, Christina Brito, and many others, have made blue scholarship a way to reimagine humanity's relationship with the non-human. Few rallying cries have been more inspirational or had a greater salutary effect in sending researchers toward real encounters with watery materiality than Hester Blum's "The Sea is Not a Metaphor," which she delivered in an important cluster of essays in PMLA in 2010. I sometimes, with deference to and admiration for Blum's massive contributions to this discourse, insert a silent only or an almost silent only, into this categorical phrase, so that the sea might not only bear metaphorical meanings. Blue Humanities thinking traces the boundaries of matter and metaphor through multiple watery contrasts. So these familiar binaries, matter versus metaphor, water versus land, blue versus green, environment versus humanity, nature versus culture, et cetera, have begun in recent years to flow into plurality. Partly, I'm thinking here about new work that I would associate with the Blue Humanities that engages with non-fluid and non-oceanic phases of water, including ice. And I note the appearance in 2022 of the book Ice Humanities, co-edited by Klaus Dobbs and Sverker Sorlin, as well as work on water vapor, swamps, and multiple other forms of freshwater. Diverse water forms have always been important to literary cultures and also to writers and scholars, but the gravitational pull of the ocean has shaped this scholarly current in the early 21st century. Many contributions, including the 2010 PMLA cluster, Cohen's novel In the Sea, and even my own 2009 At the Bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean, refer to the sea or the ocean rather than to water in all of its forms. The blue in Blue Humanities echoes what ocean-going sailors call blue water, meaning water out of sight of land, a term that originated in English in the 19th century, the early 19th century. But as we open the blue to different forms and phases of water, we arrive at a perhaps simple maxim, the third one on the list, whose implications prove hard to contain. Water's forms produce human feelings. In this phrase, I'm trying to use the words form and feelings in their most expansive possible senses, referring to physical forms and literary forms, and both to emotions and something closer to what Champlain terms experience, the physical feeling of water touching skin. Humans feel water in both senses as we enter post-human networks through blue encounters. Since I'm here at ASU, I can't resist following a slightly interstellar path to describe how ideas of binary opposition have blossomed into plurality in my thinking about planetary water. And here I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of these object lessons books. So my little object lessons book, Ocean, which Jonathan was showing everyone a few minutes ago, was published in the darkening pandemic days of March 2020. But it opens by drawing on this other little object lessons book, Earth, co-written in 2017 by local luminaries Jeffrey Cohen and Lindy Elkins-Tanton. And so in my book, I engage Elkins-Tanton's fascination with two competing theories about the origins of water on our planet. Was this essential substance part of the accretion process that formed a planetary formation approximately 4.7 billion years ago? Or alternatively, did the young Earth receive a gift of frozen water from a comet at some point in its long history? Is our planetary ocean part of the oldest core of the world? Or are the great waters alien visitors from the void? This opposition between alien and core organized my ocean's romp through planetary and human history, though I also tried to emphasize that both the alien story and the core story remain powerfully meaningful in human cultures. But my growing sense in the several years since I finished this book is that we also need a more plural and varied set of options. Water is core and alien, but that's not all that it is or makes us feel. As challenging as it can be to include many physical and emotional feelings on a crowded page, I've come to think that a still further dimension is required, which brings us back to the coast of Bohemia. Locations in early modern plays, as the Shakespeare critic John Gillies observed some time ago, create a poetic geography that enables symbolic differentiations. The book on the slide right now, A Modern Cultural History of the Czech Republic, takes its title from Shakespeare in order to emphasize what this region and its history have come to represent. Since I'm more Connecticut beachgoer than Czech historian, I'm going to take us back now to my favorite coast of Bohemia as I explore how this space is constructed in Shakespeare's play. So in The Winter's Tale, the coast of Bohemia contains many forces and functions. When King Leontes expels a then unnamed infant girl from his kingdom, he requires that his courtier Antigonus bear it to some remote and desert place quite out of our dominions. Later in the shipwreck scene, a mariner confirms that the ship and the child have reached the deserts of Bohemia. So why is this coast a desert, other than setting us up for the Blue Humanities initiative here in the desert? Thank you, Shakespeare. But I would suggest, and I think that you actually already mentioned this in the introduction, that coasts and deserts oppose each other, as anyone organizing a Blue Humanities initiative in Phoenix knows, but also the opposition is imperfect. Both places represent ecological extremes, difficult settings for human survival. The blue and Blue Humanities represents open water in opposition to green pastoralism, but as Shakespearean eco-critic Gabriel Egan has somewhat snappishly pointed out, blue water is itself a kind of desert, since only seawater that is devoid of life has a translucent blue appearance. As places alien to human flourishing, deserts and blue oceans collect settlements on their margins. Shakespeare's Bohemia, whose generative exuberance displays itself in the sheep shearing festival, announces itself as a pastoral land connected to what Antigonus erroneously calls the earth of the child's right father. En route to this fertile earth, both desert and coast represent margins of transition. The infant child's first natural environment, after a Sicilian jail cell in the courtroom, pushes across inhospitable edges. The language of coastal arrival in this play combines the oppositional forces of land and sea. After the bear chases Antigonus off stage, the shepherd describes the location as by the seaside, browsing of ivy. To borrow from Blue Shakespearean Dan Brayton the phrase that he borrows from Melville, this environment is terraqueous, a mixture of the green and the blue. The clown, in a passage that I'll return to, describes the space as by sea and by land. We're on the edge, on Carson's mixed margin, in the porous, semi-aquatic environment explored by eco-materialist scholars such as Stacy Alimo, Melody Jew, and Karen Ingersoll, among others. Terraqueous Bohemia, with its physical and imaginative qualities, also resembles the moist mixtures of American swampland that Monique Allawart describes as an alternate materialism. Allawart suggests that the material hybridity of the American tropics, in ways that are largely, she says, developed by Afro-Americans, connects land-sea dynamism with the legacies of Edward Glissant and the Black Atlantic vision of Paul Gilroy, Stephanie Smallwood, and others. More recently, scholarship by Christina Sharp, Tiffany Lethabo King, Kevin Dawson, and Karen Eva Carr have demonstrated the indigenous and African roots of global water cultures. Lethabo King's idea of the Black Shoals seems especially resonant for Shakespeare's shipwreck coast. The shallow water of a shoal, Lethabo King notes, is as much a dynamic and moving set of processes and ecological relations as it is a longitudinal and latitudinal coordinate that cartographers attempt to fix in time and space. The geodynamism of shoals generates shipwrecks and other hybridizations. Jonathan Howard has recently highlighted the need to bring Black and Blue scholarship into dialogue. My talk today won't fully connect the land-sea fantasy of Shakespeare's coast of Bohemia to the Black studies waters of Lethabo King, Sharp, Dawson, and Howard, though I believe that project is currently underway and I eagerly await its advancement. But I do want to emphasize that the coast of Bohemia, between shore and land, between shipwreck and bear, spans the post-human alienation of the Blue Humanities and the political urgency of Black eco-studies. In the space that remains, I'll provide a blue eco reading of water across three distinct materialities in the second half of The Winter's Tale, or actually across the whole Winter's Tale. Tears, which move water across and out of human bodies, a wave, which serves as a human-sized metaphor, a human-sized material metaphor, and lastly, the stormy ocean, which represents global circulation. Gathering these water forms as constituents of the Bohemian coast enables the blue humanities to speak to human, poetic, and planetary structures. The water in our bodies, in our minds, and in our world represents alien and core forces through its intimate and disorienting touch. Tears represent moving water, in which the inner fluids of the human body spill out of their confines into a wider world. Scholarship on the history of emotions has shown that tears and other bodily waters represent often gendered ideas about continence and stability, in which leaky bodies, particularly female bodies, appear dangerously porous. Tears overflow from stormy conditions of imbalance through dynamic relationships among the four bodily humors that Gail Kern-Taster has called the body's weather. Eco-materialist scholarship, including water-focused insights from Stacy Alimo, Astuta Namanis, and Jennifer May Hamilton, suggests that porosity is a basic condition of embodiment, as well as a purported gender asymmetry. Alimo's influential notion of transcorporeality has been developed in Namanis's water-focused scholarship into intimate analyses of human and more than human bodies in which, quote, water can only serve as a connection because it expresses and facilitates difference. In collaboration with Hamilton, Namanis has developed weathering as an analytic frame to explore how humans survive engagement with powerful non-human forces. Developed in dialogue with Gerald Wisner's indigenous concept of survivance, Namanis and Hamilton's weathering occupies a space between, in their words, the neoliberal heroics of resilience and the victim politics of vulnerability. To survive a storm or a hostile coastline, or a particularly angry king in the first half of The Winter's Tale, one needs a weathered body. Hamilton employs this form of analysis in Shakespearean context when she observes that King Lear, when faced with the hot tears of his own shame, wishes to pluck out his water-releasing eyes. The king's fear of bodily water, which Hamilton describes through his fantasies of expelling it, displacing it, transforming it, contrasts with his eager confrontation of the pelting storm and its floodwaters. In The Winter's Tale, however, while Leontes shares Lear's anxieties and his misogynist rage, the king's tears arrive later and produce close to the opposite dramatic effect. At the end of the courtroom scene, after the apparent deaths of his wife and son, tears serve the chastened monarch as partial consolation. Once a day I'll visit their graves, Leontes assures Paulina, and tears shed there shall be my recreation. The contrast with King Lear seems precise. The old king of tragedy rejects internal water, while the regenerative king of romance treats tears as balm, although perhaps very slow acting balm. This refiguration of bodily water helps partly unravel the masculine logic of shame. In The Winter's Tale, tears have a complex relationship to Hermione's feminine domain. Upon being accused of infidelity, the queen declares herself not prone to weeping, as our sex commonly are, the want of which vain dew perchance shall dry your pities. Her inner dryness, which perhaps anticipates the deserts of Bohemia, exchanges female tears for noble sadness. I have, Hermione says, that honorable grief lodged here, which burns worse than tears drown. In the barren landscape of Sicilia, she refuses to cry. But when her ghost appears to Antigonus on the coast of Bohemia, her eyes became two spouts. The tears that she rejects in Sicilia gush forth on the Bohemian coast. These tear spouts, as I'll show later, mark the transition between the two kingdoms and represent the surging oceans of the shipwrecked coast. The play's voyages to and from Bohemia unloose waters internal and external, including most obviously the sea and storm, which I'll get to in a minute, but also more human tears. The most tearful scene in the play, although all the weeping is off stage, is the reunion of the kings and their children in Sicilia in Act 5, Scene 2. A gentleman describes the scene as joy weighted in tears. Attempting to describe Perdita's reaction to her mother's supposed death, Words almost fail. I would fain say she bled tears, reports the steward, for I am sure my heart wept blood. In a comic anticlimax, the clown closes the weep fest by claiming to have been so moved by his royal in-law's generosity that he wept. And there was the first gentleman-like tears that ever we shed. Still more liquid balm comes in the next and final scene, not from human tears, but from the sacred vials from which Hermione asked the gods to pour your graces upon my daughter's head. Water that the queen refused to shed and that the king took as daily medicine for 16 years has now become divine anointment. Sicilia has become a wet place. So it's perhaps not a surprise that in this play's tragicomic, that this play's tragicomic form uncovers abundance where King Lear found emptiness. But the watery metaphors of The Winter's Tale do not depict stillness, equilibrium, or even constancy. The play presents not sustainability, but dynamism. Florizel's depiction of Perdita as an ocean wave in Acts 4, Scene 4, in Florizel's depiction of Perdita as an ocean wave, Shakespeare celebrates watery change through an only partly predictable form. The key to watery survival in the aftermath of the shipwreck appears in an extended metaphor of Perdita as moving water. And this is Florizel describing Perdita. When you do dance, I wish you a wave of the sea, that you might ever do nothing but that, move still, still so, and own no other function. These lines literalize the Blue Humanities paradox, and water represents both motion and stillness. Water does, moves, and owns nothing but its own curling form. The echoing repetition of move still, still so, which redoubles Florizel's earlier echo, sell so, so give, from 5 lines before, freezes Perdita, while also lining up a series of initial letters S as if a parallel row of breaking waves. The truncated rhythm of this line, with 4 stresses rather than the usual 5, also suggests a wave that has not quite reached its peak. Waves, like dancing, comprise pattern motion in a temporarily stable form. Coastal dwellers know that waves combine repetition with variation. They own no other function beyond bringing water to shore, but the precise disposition of their points of contact vary endlessly. Recalling Carson's poignant admonition, for no 2 successive days is the shoreline precisely the same, we might see in Florizel's metaphor an impossible fantasy of sameness that will not persist for 2 successive waves, or even for 2 successive instants. Each serving crest of water always moves on as the wave ripples through moving water. Florizel's metaphor captures one of several moments in which he idealizes his pastoral love. Unlike the patriarchs whose kingdoms he will inherit, the Bohemian prince embraces motion. For Perdita, however, the key symbolic action comes when the frightened Proserpina lets fall her flowers. She's worried about what happens when the wave breaks. In holding the wave perpetually still the moment before it breaks, Florizel, a happy surfer on a glassy face, like the eco-critics frolicking in the slide here in Santa Barbara, imagines an eternal present with no closeout. Bonus points if anybody can identify the people in the picture later. Like flowers and waves, she is moving and will change soon. But in that poetic instant, the dancer and the wave capture pure form. Perdita as wave occupies a human-sized middle between the microcosm of tears and the macrocosm of the sea and storm. In turning now to the shipwreck scene itself, I emphasize the planet-covering ocean as, to a first approximation, the surface of our world. In the ocean historian Helen Roswadowski's wonderfully direct phrase from her 2018 book, Vast Expanses, the ocean is, quote, the dominant feature of planet Earth. The Winter's Tale's distinctive version of Shakespeare's shipwreck topos de-emphasizes political disorder by muting the doomed sailors. There is no refrain of "we split." The sailors all drown, but they all drown silently off stage. The ship functions as a symbol of cosmic order and disorder viewed primarily from the shore. The clown's prose description of the disaster paraphrases the shipwreck with spectator paradigm that aristocrats in the audience might have known from Lucretius, or possibly from Othello, Act 2, Scene 1, or The Tempest, Act 1, Scene 2, or lots of other places also. But this shipwreck bars rather than facilitates vision. Oh, the most piteous cry of the poor souls, sometimes to see 'em and not to see 'em. Now the ship boring the moon with her mainmast and anon swallowed with yeast and froth, as you'd thrust a cork into a hogshead. But to make an end of the ship, to see how the sea flapdragoned it. The clown pictures oceanic nature as devouring maw. Everything moves, but chaotically. The ship bounces between moon and froth, gets thrust into a hogshead, is flapdragoned, and then disappears. The order-chewing shipwreck does have a land service in the bear who eats Antigonus, but if there's a body left to bury, then the sea disaster proves the more complete of the two. Unlike in The Tempest, no mariners survive. As it often does, shipwreck punctuates the plot, with the lost ship opening a symbolic and narrative break between Sicilia and Bohemia. The supernatural coloring of the catastrophe comes by way of Hermione's unseen ghost. This figure, who speaks only in Antigonus's report of his dream, represents both storm and comfort, protecting the child with a resonant name, Perdita, I prithee call it, and guiding the play to places remote enough in Bohemia. Antigonus describes her in reverent terms. To me comes a creature, sometimes her head on one side, some another. I never saw a vessel of like sorrow, so filled and so becoming. In pure white robes, like very sanctity, she did approach my cabin where I lay, bowed before me, and gasping to begin some speech, her eyes became two spouts, the fury spent. This quasi-ghost, Hermione's not dead, so this vessel seems even more mysterious than the vengeful spirits of old Hamlet or Banquo, transforms sorrow and sanctity into wet fury. Her waterspout eyes channel the stormy sea. Her undead speech flows through the violent gap at the play's center. So at this point, trying to make sense of this image of the ghost of Hermione, I want to bring in an illustration as an interpretive aid. I'll use an image to help understand the roiling disorder that shipwreck makes on this coast. This image is an abstract photograph that made by the artist Rosamund Purcell, and the title of the image, Boring the Moon, comes from the clown's language that I just quoted. The photograph is part of a collaborative project with the Shakespeare critic Michael Whitmore, published in 2011 in the book Landscapes of the Passing Strange. Purcell took the photograph, and it is important that it's a photograph, not a painting, even though it looks like an abstract painting in many ways. Purcell took the photograph by reflecting light off the curved outer surface of mirrored mercury jars, which are designed to store sensitive dyes. And here's a picture of one of the jars that she used. And in creating the image through this curved reflection, the artist produces shapes that are partly representational and also substantially distorted. That's exactly how this play represents shipwreck. You can see things in the picture, as I hope you can see here. The ship is down here, and Hermione, or something like Hermione's ghost, is up there facing the other direction. But nothing looks the slightest bit natural. Deliberate distortion allows the photograph to allegorize Shakespeare's environmental art. The image gathers objects together while it distorts any system to interpret them. It's through artistic distortion that we understand catastrophe to the limited extent to which we do understand it. Shakespeare's words and Purcell's image represent crises of legibility that rupture conventional ideas about humanity and nature. Like a cork in a hogshead, the ship moves dynamically in a fluid environment. The up and down movement of the description, from moon to wave, is conventional, though in many versions of this poetic topos, this ship descends into hell and rises up to heaven. In this case, the rising and falling ship remains bounded by the natural but inhuman spaces of moon and ocean. These locations seem, if anything, less comprehensible than the supernatural alternatives of heaven and hell. Being in this nature, in this oceanic world, does not entail participating in a coherent world picture, but rather living inside one of Purcell's photographs. The surroundings are unsettling, shifting, gorgeous, and inhuman. There is a story of immersion and survival here, but it's not a clear one. Responding to this disorderly environment, the clown attempts but cannot quite allegorize the storm. His language, which I've already partly quoted, remains conventional, but it is also interestingly self-erasing. I have seen two such sights by sea and by land, but I am not to say it is a sea, for now it is the sky. Betwixt the firmament and it, you cannot thrust a bodkin's point. Violent wet weather obscures normal oppositions. The clown's rustic idiom, new to the play, is nearly strangled at birth. I am not to say is what he somewhat strangely says. Mixed opposites and radical juxtapositions define the storm. The scene recalls Lear's rage at thunder. In the Winter's Tale, in the Winter's Tale, the storm separates two clearly opposed narratives that frame the generic and geographic transition from Cecilia's tragic loss to Bohemia's pastoral renewal. The cork in a hogshead is a country metaphor, and the rustic language partly domesticates the sea. Like so many ships, this one is tossed, but the loud weather also transports the play itself. Hermione's ghost and Antigonus both concur that the coast of Bohemia is where he and baby Perdita belong. The watery ecology of this scene represents a nature that humans can neither escape nor understand, even if the audience easily recognizes its function as part of a providential narrative. The stormy sea tells a story of supreme artifice and opacity. Eco-theorist Timothy Morton's admonition that nature is not a mirror for our mind matches what the shipwreck demonstrates. Humans cannot separate themselves from non-human systems, and the ecologies in which we find ourselves always change. The catastrophe of shipwreck places instability and survival at the heart of ecological experience. Not only can we not have the happy hierarchies of the great chain of being or the pastoral fantasies of green sustainable living, but the interlocked system we do have are marked by disaster. As if unloosed by the storm from confinement in narrow Sicilian paranoia, the Bohemian half of the play teems with globalizing vectors. The ocean becomes, in Jeffrey Cohen's helpful phrase, a conveyance machine. After being brought into open conflict with his father, Florizel puts to sea because he cannot hold on shore. Camillo's plan launches them towards unpathed waters, undreamed shores. Back in Sicilia, even static Leontes becomes newly aware of dreadful Neptune, which he fears threatens the paragon Perdita. Even Autolycus's ballad about a woman turned into a cold fish for she would not exchange flesh with one that loved her contributes to the general upsurge of sea imagery. Autolycus's sea may represent something like a globalized sex fantasy with upwellings of popular culture, the cash marketplace, petty crime, and the legacy of the Elizabethan writer Robert Greene, who supplies both the play's main plot and also most of its subplots. The thin water of Sicilian tears becomes a Bohemian ocean of conveyance and exchange. All this water overwhelms and remakes the play. Water makes things happen in The Winter's Tale, whether that water is tears, a wave, or the ocean. One practical definition in dramatic terms of the coast of Bohemia might simply be something like, it's a place where things happen that can't happen elsewhere. But non-human agency and its shapes remain a set of much debated topics in contemporary eco-criticism. And I'll dip into this divide by way of an initial conclusion by responding to a recent attack on eco-materialist rhetoric leveled by the British theorist Timothy Clark in his 2019 book, The Value of Eco-Criticism. Clarke snipes by name at a few different eco-materialists, including several who engage directly with watery environments. But since I'm here at ASU, I may as well focus on his jabs at our favorite dean of the humanities, Jeffrey Cohen. Cohen's description of the Mississippi River, here on the slide, as an earth artist in the introduction to his 2013 volume, Prismatic Ecology, draws Clarke's ire because of his direct appeal to non-human narrative agency. The river's story proceeds at a geologic pace. As Cohen says, its projects take so long to execute that humans have a difficult time discerning their genius. But the river's curves remain recognizable as art. The Mississippi's serpentine play echoes the ocean wave of Perdita dancing on a massively inhuman timescale. Chronological variability challenges but does not bar interpretation. Humans cannot see the genius in experiential time, but the river's restless agency is easily readable in its engendered worlds. Interpreting this art requires new habits of seeing across time and space. Clarke disputes these claims about narrative, and there's an element of this disagreement that I think is worth drawing out. For Cohen, attention to the agency of the river humbles human subjectivity by admitting that the inhuman is not ours to control. For Clarke, however, the word artist and related terms such as Serpil Opperman's storied matter flattens the non-human into shapes built for humans. The contention inheres in the terms story and artist. Narrative seems to Clarke a human imposition, even though stories often escape human comprehension. I suggest that the key terms may not be story and artist so much as river and water. Non-human forces do not simply initiate the stories which humans extend through language and imagination, but rather these forces comprise fluid vectors, whether we are thinking about the erosive Mississippi carving loops into the continent, or on a different scale, the salt pressure of tears forcing themselves out of the corner of a human eye. Any uneasiness about celebrating the Mississippi as artist may emerge from the conceptual difficulty of taking the materiality in eco-materialism seriously. Things do things, even if they need people to tell their stories. What Cohen's 2015 book Stone calls liveliness repays excavation precisely because dead matter moves human hearts. As Giulio Romano's marble statue has a real woman or a boy actor's body inside of it, so stone, for Cohen, proffers a perilous tender of mineral amity. Eco-materialists emphasize communication and dynamism between human and inanimate beings. On the coast of Bohemia, these qualities organize themselves in a supernatural logic, but theatrical magic and literary genius are not necessary. The description of coastlines with which we started today emphasizes that all coasts, like all rivers, all waves, and all tears, contain ephemerality and change. Eco-materialist storied matter and visions of non-human artistry, from the curving Mississippi to the Globe Theatre in London, contain multitudes of forms. Matter makes stories, but not all stories are simple. Shakespeare's multi-voiced and multi-generic plays bring multiple story forms into dramatic and mutually corrosive contact. The Shipwreck in Purcell's photograph visualizes the rich opacity of Shakespeare's environmental art. The least explicable mystery in the play might not be the living woman who stands like a statue in Act 5, but instead the ghost of the same not really dead woman who appears in a dream in Act 3. Shakespeare's dramatic practice works in combinations and perspectival shifts, sensitive to objects and pressures beyond human control. The largest material opacity in Western culture floats offshore, fills our bodies, and fires our imaginations. The post-human paradigm of the blue humanities insists that the substance which makes us human remains alien to us. Water, including but not limited to the ocean on our planet, the river in our heartland, and the fluid in our bodies, feels familiar and foreign. The river makes art, but not only for us. The coast changes the story, but not only in fiction. Moving into and through water via eco-theoretical analyses and physical practices challenges us to craft a language supple enough to engage human and non-human narratives of agency. But rather than end today amid the muddy entanglements of eco-theory and critical sniping, I will return to poetry. Bachmann's Bohemia Lies by the Sea conjures a coastline that embraces water and imagination. The poet avails herself of Shakespeare's fantasy Bohemia to respond to the trials of history, specifically her own life, writing in German from around mid-century to her death in Italy in 1973. Her poem emphasizes trials, but its core seems to be not her own failures or successes, but a dynamism generated by Bohemia itself. Through trials, the land reaches water, as Bohemia one fine day was released to the sea and now lies by water. It's a strange image in which land itself floats down an imaginative stream after having been released from the vice of history. Does Bohemia dissolve like silt into the big muddy? As Bachmann returns at the end of the poem from nation to self, she settles in a Bohemia that may not exist, that remains in doubt, but that also defines her artistic choice. She ends the poem by calling herself a Bohemian, a wandering minstrel, who has nothing, who is held by nothing, gifted only at seeing by a doubtful sea, the land of my choice. The English puns between sea meaning to perceive and sea meaning ocean do not operate in German, although we could hear them in the Shakespeare a little while ago. But the contrast here between the sea being doubtful, strittig in German, and the land being my choice, meiner Wahl, rings forcefully in both languages. Her coast of Bohemia spans the blue waters of doubt and the green shores of choice. This terraqueous fantasy, as Bachmann imagines it in late 20th century Europe, and as Shakespeare constructed it in early 17th century London, meanders downriver through uncertainty into experience. To survive in a wet blue-green world requires endurance and imagination. These are qualities that Blue Humanities thinking values and that this strain of criticism seeks in the water, but also aims to bring back to the shore. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, for a mesmerizing lecture, eloquent, beautifully illustrated, and the following is a close reading that in its theoretical overview and broad range. We have time for questions, and we have a custom now of an attendance list, which is a handout, just so that you can have some. But you know, Aaron, anybody who would like to start with?
I have so much to say. I think I'll receive a little bit tomorrow too, so
Yeah.
I would rather give it to people.
It's very political, definitely.
So let me, I'm not sure we need mics.
Oh, it's for the recording.
Okay, so for the recording, I'm very interested in the way that you wanted to expand the reach of Blue Humanities beyond the oceans where it began to other forms of water, including, as you showed so fascinatingly, the water within the body. I suppose there's another thing that is not actually blue, like water, but which is seen as blue and which is tremendously important ecologically, and that's the sky. And I was very interested in that moment in the clown's speech where in the storm, the sea and the sky become as one. Do you see the sky becoming part of Blue Humanities?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this one is working too. I would say basically yes. I mean, this is partly just a Blue Humanities that wants, everything, and it's in the, to go down its whale's throat. But I think that a couple of reasons that the sky might be interesting, including color, right? One is that this, there's the line of the 17th century scientist that we live at the bottom of a sea of air, right? There are two fluid bodies that are on the surface of the planet. There's a heavy and wet one, which is the ocean, and then there's a gaseous and lighter one, which is the atmosphere, which is, which we live mostly at the bottom of and mostly at the top of the other one. And so that's one thing. It's that the atmosphere is another fluid body which has a significant amount of water in it, although variable. I do think about clouds and cloud shapes as being, a ripe for blue humanities topic in the sort of broader questions around meteorology also. The question of color, I think is just an interesting one. I don't want to place too much on the blue, although I think that we were kind of the term seems to have stuck a little bit, but there is a way in, the blue in both light and water has to do with refraction and the bending of light, and it's a material environment. So I think in both cases, the color emerges from this sense of an environment that transmits, but also distorts. And which is part of what I was trying to get at in the using of the Purcell image, is the way in which distortion seems both a very powerful metaphor for what artist does and what art does to our minds, and also a very material reality of the way that we engage with our environments, especially environments that have greater or lesser amounts of water in them.
Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for such a wonderful talk. I have a lot of thoughts around the blue humanities, the blue-green aspects. So to me, there's kind of been this proliferation of terms lately. People are using the phrase critical ocean studies, hydro humanities, and one of the, I guess, critiques of blue and blue humanities has to do with the way it has been captured. The way that green, for instance, is captured to now, signify to corporations a certain kind of branding, right? Greenwashing. Is there a kind of blue washing that we should be worried about as well?
Absolutely. And I think it shows up in what's sometimes called the blue economy, the ways in which, and Sid Dobrin writes really well about this in his book, Blue Eco-Criticism, and also Elizabeth Delauchery in one of her recent books or articles, that the idea of a blue economy, that the ocean is the next frontier for capitalism, and obviously the beginning of deep sea mining for rare earth minerals and things like that, which is already started, and also the way that that climate change is going to make the northern passages available for commercial shipping, because the Northwest Passage doesn't freeze as much as it used to. So yes, I think there's absolutely a risk in, this is what capitalism does, right? It co-opts every good thing. And so I think it is just a matter of being aware of, and in whatever way is possible, resistant to the way that, that the blue also is commodifiable. There's a long history of economic thinking around the stuff we get out of the sea. Having fishery law is maybe the oldest expression of this. And there are all these fantasies about the sea being a free space, and Grotius in the 17th century writes about the mare liberum, and it's almost always not true, right? That there's always kind of countervailing effort of the mare liberum on the one hand, but the mare clausum on the other hand is every open sea is someone's open sea is someone else's closed sea almost every time.
Thanks so much. I also just really appreciate how you articulated what blue represents, in a more expansive sense of your talk. So
thank you.
So my question, it's kind of related to that question, but it's more sort of also thinking interpretively about the Winter's Tale and literary histories. And as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about Ovid's Metamorphoses, I think I'm interested in the ways in which conceptualizing, and also your third maxim, right, that water's forms produce human feelings. I'm really interested in the ways also that some of the imagery of water is associated with violence, right? So in Ovid's Metamorphoses, a lot of times a figure becomes a watery figure as an escape from a violent death, right?
Death or assault.
And so it's interesting. I mean, it's related to the idea, right, that this imagery can also sort of be co-opted or can be. So I would just be, and I also was just thinking about the way in I think that your reading of The Winter's Tale is fantastic, and I love sort of moving away from thinking about the statue as the only kind of art that
Yeah, I love the
happens.
statue too, but
I
yeah.
love the statue; makes me cry a lot of the time.
Yeah.
That end of that play, but I just think it's really interesting to move away from thinking about it just as this the kind of immateriality that is stone,
Mhm.
and thinking about it as water. But I also think that inherent in it is that kind of violence.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about what you.
I definitely think that you're right, that there is, I mean, one of the things about water is, you know, it's both necessary for life and also lethal. Like if we are submerged in it, we don't live. And so I think that the violence inherent in watery transformation as it appears, you know, when the escaping nymph has to become a pool of water or whatever in Ovid, like that threat of violence and also sometimes of escape, you know, water is the thing that runs away if it has an opportunity to do so. I think that those are, I mean, I think even in the language around water in this play, that you have the sense, just in the stuff I've been quoting, that it is both, you know, transformative and utopian in all the ways that, like, the happy half of The Winter's Tale is the happy half of The Winter's Tale, but it's also this incredible threat of violence and a kind of shattering of the self. And I actually think that the Bachmann is really good about, that's the thing I really love about that Bachmann poem, is the sense both that it's like deeply desired, you know, the land of my choice, I'll believe in the sea again, and also that it's a little shattering, that it is a little bit rupturing, even as it is also desired.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. I just have kind of a naive question. Is there sort of a difference between sort of, like, I'm thinking about like the Thames
Mhm.
as a space of water that can be somewhat controlled.
Mhm.
You can hang out with John Taylor, the water poet, and cross the Thames. And you've got lakes that you can dunk witches in. And you've got the universities that have pieces of water that are both controlled and not controlled. Is there a difference between how people talk about that kind of water as opposed to the expansive kind of
Mhm.
dangerous water?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times it just shows up in the difference between, you know, in the language of the early modern period, sweet water and salt water. You know, the Thames, of course, is an ambiguous case, right? Because it's an estuary, and so it's like sometimes a little saltier than other times, depending on weather and tide. Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea that there are some bodies of water that are domesticable and sort of manageable. And I'm thinking here about the swimming lessons of John Everard Digby in, you know, rivers near Cambridge, and the way in which, you know, it's like an opportunity for display and you know, and sort of human skills that can enable you to, you know, swim like a dolphin, swim like a frog, whatever. But also even in Digby, there's this sense that, like, you got to be careful and you got to know what you're doing. And like humans can learn to swim by imitating other creatures, but, you know, you got to read my book in order to learn how to do it, right? I mean, so there's this sense that not every human knows swimming, and swimming is a cultivated skill, like other kinds of water survival skills. Yes.
It's a kind of follow-up to that question. Could you say a bit more about different bodily waters? I mean, the thing I thought about was the tanner, who I talked about yesterday, who is less porous because of the tanning process, which involves urine. And I just wondered if the different waters are doing different things, because we know they are the same fluid in the body.
I was thinking about that when we were talking about the tanner and the you know, water is a, I don't have the line anymore, but water is just tear is a strong decayer of your whoreson dead body in the graveyard scene in Hamlet. Yeah, I mean, obviously again, there's this difference in saline content, right? So that blood has more salt in it, and blood and tears are relatively salty. Urine is also salty. Semen is also salty. Like there are different kinds of salt content in the various bodily fluids, and also it has to do with humoral theory also understands different bodily fluids in different ways. And so, like, the thing I love about that image of the tanner who makes himself a little bit waterproof because of the process of his trade is this sense. I mean, it's very much like what Nemanis and Hamilton describe as weathering. Like we think of weathering, they were writing this in a sort of Australian background, like weathering is the thing that happens when you're exposed to the weather and especially to the sun or the desert heat. But weathering also, like there's, I guess, a biomechanical side to weathering in which you can tan your body a little bit, or other kinds of any kind of habitual practice with a material will inevitably have some of that material rubbing off onto and into your skin and flesh. So it's very much like you're talking about flesh yesterday. Like it's all flesh is wet and bones are dry.
So this is also a bit of a follow-up to the previous question. So you began on the coast, and you kind of gave this really compelling account of that constant change and how it's almost chaotic and never the same and no lines. And I suppose I was thinking about that and I think, well, yeah, but there are tide tables, and if you live on the coast and if you make your living on the sea and the coast, the sea in that sense is incredibly predictable, and we can
yes and no, right? I mean,
well, we can predict years ahead where the tide's going to be. People working on, I can't remember which play is it, Henry V, or it's one of the plays where there's even work on what was the tide like at Bankside on the moment that play was being presented, because some crazy authorship thing about it. So we can look backwards, we know what the sea was doing. So there is a sense in which the coast especially is an area of kind of unpredictability, but also deep predictability.
Yeah. I mean, in the 16th and 17th century, the tides were poorly understood. Like they were obviously associated on some level with the moon, but the physics of it was poorly understood. My understanding is that even in the present, there's a certain amount of variability. Like we have a very good sense of when high tide is going to be, and a pretty good sense of the extent of the tides under ordinary conditions. Obviously, it can be adjusted by any kind of meteorological abnormality, like a storm will change the tide route. But I do believe that there's still, like, the system is complex enough that our predictions are not 100% accurate. Like we know which will be the highest tide of the month, like that's relatively consistent. But the sort of precise shapes of tidal, I mean, they're very poorly understood, I think, in the early modern period, and I think still like much better understood now. But I think there's still a certain amount of uncertainty. There's an error bar in the tide charts that I absolutely depend on the tide chart all summer for my timing my daily swimming, but it also isn't always right? Like the sense of absolute mastery of that complicated movement of the fluid body, the atmosphere, disturbances in one or the other, storms and currents and disturbances in the hydrologic system. I think all that stuff is on that there's a certain amount of margin for error in that still. I'm not speaking with absolute expertise, but that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the experience of living next to the sea is that it's always different, but it's always the same.
Well, yeah, that makes sense too. Yes, that the the pattern is regular with variation. Yeah. Mhm.
I think we have some nibbles next door, and so I was just wondering, is that right, Jacob? Yeah. So I wonder if this is a moment where Hassan wants to ask a question, but perhaps we could now move to a more informal questioning. This has been amazing. I mean, I could not have imagined a better introduction to the Blue Humanities Initiative than this. I remember there's a wonderful moment in Michel Serres' great book, The Natural Contract, where he says the problem with academics is that they spend too much time indoors in libraries. We need to listen to the wisdom of shepherds and sailors because they understand weather, and from them we can learn about the natural contract. The thing about Steve is because he's a swimmer, he is an immersive, an outdoor critic, and I think that is one of the keys to the beauty as well as the power of his work. So I just want you to join me in thanking him, and then we can carry on more informally. So Steve, thank you so much.